Full volume, as fast and as loud as it can go. We continue our journey here, preparing for the big move out of Berlin, the escape from Berlin, I like to call it. Welcome back, Artist Journal, September 17th, 2025. Broadcasting from somewhere out there, somewhere scientific, as Guillaume Apollinaire would put it. So it continues, and it's very interesting. I'm trying to get to a point, which I haven't reached yet, where there's zero preparation. I want it to be like a real journal where I go, I wonder what I think of that, and then I go and look. And I think if I do that, I mean, in my mind's eye, if there's zero preparation, then I can do it almost every day, is how I think of it. So it's kind of fun. I mean, again, it's almost an illustration of the tyranny of reason. Because then my reason comes in and goes, well, you can't just say anything. How's that going to go? And you have to prepare. But then it turns into a lecture, right? And that's not a journal. And so I'm still, here I am, finally, here I am 450 episodes later, still trying to figure it out, as we all are. Okay, so let's look. So the impetus of this show was, let's just look at some analytical cubism, analytic cubism and synthetic cubism. Let's look at the two and just compare and some examples. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But then your rational mind goes, well, what are the primary documents of cubism, in a sense? Like, who came up with this whole business? What is the real history of this whole business? And then you realize, or I realize, and I'm sure there are seminars, in other words, like entire classes of 20 lectures on cubism. Like, then you realize, okay, this isn't just like a few dudes and dudettes, having some fun here. And it's actually quite impressive in that regard, in the sense that you see how serious people are. That in a sense, again, we're back to like one of the terms that I discovered, as we're going to see here, Guillaume Apollinaire, what we call analytic cubism, you could argue is what he called scientific cubism. Very interestingly. So, with that all being said, we're going to look here today at, I started with just a bunch of cubist portraits of Guillaume Apollinaire, whose text we're going to focus on just a page and a half, basically, where he goes through the different kinds of cubism, a very important document. And it never really stuck, interestingly, a lot of these terms. But it eventually, as we'll see from the primary documents, gets synthesized, so to speak, or it gets transformed into another, into a simpler, it gets boiled down into these simpler categories of analytic and synthetic cubism, which will probably take a few shows. I don't know if I'll keep going on this. I assume I will. Which might take a few shows to kind of figure out and get to, so to speak. So let's start taking a look here. So here's an artist I hadn't heard of before. Kind of looks like a Picasso, doesn't it? This is from 1912, Guillaume Apollinaire. So here's the person we're going to be looking at. Quite a beautiful work here. À Paris, chez sa 1000 bloc rue Est. So it looks like his address. I wonder where that is. You know what's rad about Paris? Maybe I mentioned this in a previous episode. I was walking in, I believe it was the 6th arrondissement, right there on that same street that the famous Impressionism Museum, which I'm not l'Orangerie, what is the name of? Musée d'Orsay. Where the same street as the Musée d'Orsay, if you keep walking and walking towards the 5th, you'll see up on the wall on the right, you'll see there's a flower. A fresh rose was there when I was there. This is where Jacques Lacan, not a big fan of his writing, but maybe ChatGPT can help us learn about Jacques Lacan. Summarize it for us. But there is what's cool about Paris is there you see a fresh rose taped onto the wall, which said, this is where Jacques Lacan practiced psychiatry from 1930 to 1980, whatever. That's what's cool about Paris. So, so when I see the address here, I go, oh, what I think is the Bloc Rue Est. It's kind of hard to read. Rue Nord, number 366. When I see that, I go, oh, that's cool. Such a city of history. Where I'll be in a few weeks, and then hopefully it's looking like February may land there in a more semi-permanent way. But we shall see. Anyways, let's take a look at the works. Guillaume Apollinaire. This is by an artist who I had never heard of, Louis Marcoussis. And we have a nice, actually, summary here. Portrait of Guillaume Apollinaire, 1912 to 1920. Interesting. So I just kind of liked how that one looked, so I started with it. But here's actually a nice little summary of Apollinaire. Apollinaire, Wilhelm Apollinaris de Krastrowiecki, almost sounds Polish. A poet, indeed, a poet of illegitimate birth and mixed Polish and Italian ancestry. Interesting. Settled in Paris and began signing his poems Guillaume Apollinaire in 1903. This brings up a whole other issue, which is your name. It seems like a pretty wise, from a just purely branding point of view. Nice move, I would argue. This is a little bit harder, probably people couldn't even pronounce his name. You saw me struggle with it there. Let's continue. So changed his name in 1903 at age 23. I think it was more common back then too as well. He mixed with a circle of artists and writers that included Picasso and the author Alfred Jarry, and became the lover of the painter Marie Laurencin. He edited a number of reviews, published satirical and semi-pornographic texts, and proclaimed that the writings of the Marquis de Sade would dominate the 20th century. You know what's sad about that? In a weird way, he was right. Although not in the way that he probably thought. He thought probably, literarily speaking, they would dominate, and that was kind of, in a sense, that is, as I keep mentioning J.G. Ballard here, that is the tradition that Ballard was basically in, but in a sense, but unfortunately, where Sade, you could argue, dominated was unfortunately in our news reports. One could argue. In 1918, Apollinaire died from wounds he suffered from the First World War. So died in the First World War. Interesting, right at the end there. From wounds he suffered in the First World War, his stature as a forerunner of surrealism continued to grow after his death, largely due to the intense eroticism and highly original verbal and typographical styles that are the hallmarks of his work. Fascinating. So, yeah, okay, excellent. So, died in 1918, quite young. So, died at 38, pretty young. Here's another one. This is from 1908. This is kind of seen as an early example of cubism. This is Jean Metzinger. I assume Jean Metzinger. And so I'm going to show you a few portraits, then we're going to get more into, just to get us started here. So this is 1908. Interesting. Here's Jean Metzinger, 1911. I think this is pretty famous, and I believe, again, this is Apollinaire. Let me just fix this. Étude, so study for the portrait of Guillaume Apollinaire, graphite on paper. And I think there are a couple of different versions, interestingly. So a study. Nice and minimal, isn't it? Beautiful work here. And again, you see this kind of, the hallmarks of cubism, which we're going to get into here. Here's also Louis Marcoussis. I believe that was 1912. Let me just see, 1912. So again, so here we are. We saw 1911. This is 1908. And generally, analytic cubism is generally the dates you get put on it are, I think you can go to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which interestingly, and I'll probably bring this up in a future episode here, was considered by the art dealer who also wrote an important work on cubism, who actually defined the terms, analytic and synthetic. He considered Les Demoiselles d'Avignon an unfinished work. Now, so I'm learning all sorts of stuff, because you know what's interesting going to the primary documents? It's sort of like you are kind of given whatever someone has interpreted as important. But then when I go to this, I see scientific cubism. What on earth is this? When I go, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was unfinished? You don't read that. I don't remember that. I mean, this is such a famous painting. So let's continue. We'll get into that in a second. So just the importance, as we all go on our journey, the importance of primary documents. All right. The Poet by Pablo Picasso. So probably Apollinaire. We see the pipe here, a cubist work, and here, portrait of Guillaume Apollinaire. This is 1913. You see the muted colors, and here, this is also Picasso. We don't have too much detail. Chalk, apparently, but you know what? I find these descriptions are usually terrible. So it looks like ink, paper, and graphite is what I would call that, but not sure. Maybe there's some chalk in there too. Interesting portrait. Here. Now, a lot of us are familiar with this image. Of course, this is Giorgio de Chirico. But it's interesting to just kind of put everything together here. This is 1914. It shows, to a certain degree, it shows what a visionary de Chirico is. Because look at how early de Chirico is doing his metaphysical paintings. This is a famous one. Portrait of Guillaume Apollinaire is the title of this, and this almost looks like Guillaume Apollinaire, the profile. What's funny is, speaking of profiles in de Chirico, if I do a profile, and then we should almost bring that up. If I do a profile, and then we bring up, it's pretty hilarious. I have to bring this up. De Chirico profile, I want to call it auto self-portrait. I believe it's at MoMA. We'll see if any of this comes through. Yeah, here we go. I think I've shown this before, actually. It's kind of funny. Yes. So there's Giorgio de Chirico. Anyways, Giorgio de Chirico also doing, here's Guillaume Apollinaire. One assumes, but it kind of looks like it. 1914. So just kind of an interesting cross-pollination, because again, when you go to the books, you don't necessarily, it's the importance of chronology. When you're doing history, one could argue, and this isn't a lecture, this is a journal, which is why I have all my tangents here. But nevertheless, interesting. I never would have thought of putting de Chirico into this mix. But then when I did a search on Guillaume Apollinaire, power of the internet as well. This was also interesting because here's Sotheby's. I'm like, Max Ernst, did they mistitle this work, or misattribute? I mean, this is de Chirico. It's even signed de Chirico, and this is actually Max Ernst doing a copy of de Chirico's portrait of Guillaume Apollinaire. Of course, as far as I recall, Max Ernst again was the story I remember. I think it's actually in this book there's the main Werner Spies is the main scholar, from my understanding, of Max Ernst, or one of the main ones is probably a better way of putting it. And I believe it's a story from his large book, I think it's just called Max Ernst, where he describes how, as I've mentioned before here, Ernst seeing a de Chirico work in a, window in Paris, changed the trajectory of his life, and he became a painter, like his father. Now, so this, interestingly, we have a bit of a story here. This striking work belongs to a fascinating chapter in the history of forgery. I don't know if I'd consider this a forgery. Let's see. An appropriation within the Surrealist movement, long attributed to Giorgio de Chirico and catalogued as such in the renowned and understandably, it is in fact a work by Max Ernst. Inspired by de Chirico's enigmatic portrait de Guillaume Apollinaire from 1914, Ernst created the present charcoal drawing after encountering Pierre Roy's woodcut translation of the original painting. So isn't this interesting? We talk about traveling through the mediums over here. So here is the original de Chirico. Here is the woodcut. And then here is Max Ernst's copy of the woodcut. Super interesting. Again, putting the signature in there. I think as they mention here. Do we have anything else here? When Hua's print was republished in Minotaur in May 1934, it prompted Ernst's reinterpretation, a drawing that bears a forged de Chirico signature and an inscription falsely dating it to 1913. So finally, de Chirico's portrait, one of his best-known metaphysical works, depicted not so much a likeness of the poet Guillaume Apollinaire as an assemblage of haunting classical forms. Exactly. It's not that this is necessarily an exact portrait. I feel like this profile in the background probably is actually more the real portrait. And in a sense, like if we were to interpret this, if we were to have some fun and do our fresh interpretation here, as I prefer to do, to me, what is this? So, okay, you go, okay, this very cool guy with the sunglasses, frankly, very kind of contemporary. This is a personality made of the things of his imagination. In a sense, this is a portrait of inner space, one could argue, of these images perhaps attributed, or that de Chirico, the poet, puts, attributes to Apollinaire. De Chirico, the poet, attributes to Apollinaire. So maybe thinking of a fish, maybe, I don't know if this is a shell, a bust, a classical bust. You see this, it's almost like a reference to cubism. And then, to me, the shadow here, that is very likely, the closest we get to, quote-unquote, the real de Chirico. So that is how I would, describe it. A very interesting piece here. You see how radical this is. And you see with this, as we're going to see here, these artists, in a sense, what was so revolutionary about what they were doing is it was about the dissolution, really, I would argue to a certain degree, of the image, or of the of representation, is actually how I'd put it. It was the dissolution of representation, and here we're going to see a whole bunch of examples of these different artists that are mentioned by Apollinaire of this dissolution of representation. And so that's why I think it was so kind of, so I think it'll explain a lot. So here are the primary documents here. The term analytic cubism and synthetic cubism were not used by Picasso or Braque themselves. Very significantly. They were retrospective categories created later by critics and dealers. The key primary sources, and I was mentioning this person before, Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, Der Weg zum Kubismus, The Rise of Cubism, which they have on the archive.org. I will bring this up. Maybe next episode, next Monday. Let's see. I'm moving actually on Monday, so I may have to take off. I may have to take off a week, at least from the Monday, Wednesday. Let's see. We'll figure it out. So Kahnweiler was Picasso and Braque's dealer. So I was looking at this book, and that's where I was discovering all of this very important information on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. This is one of the first systematic accounts of Cubism where he describes the logic of analysis, breaking down objects into facets, and their later synthesis, bringing in signs, collage, and more color. Now, the reason they write it like this, or ChatGPT writes it like this, is because at no point in that text does Kahnweiler ever say, this is analytic cubism, this is synthetic cubism. What happens is he describes the thinking, as it says here, the logic, that these earlier works were more about analysis and kind of breaking apart the image. Apollinaire has a slightly different angle on it. And whereas the later works are more about building up from this kind of foundation, these kind of basic elements, and then rebuilding up from there. So he's more describing the thinking, but he never said, this is analytic, this is synthetic cubism, significantly. So you see how these things, these ideas, here you have the people who are actually doing the paintings, they're not calling it that. And then here you have, written in 1915, as things are starting to wrap up there, and probably the First World War in 1914 probably helped wrap things up. Published in 1920, he's just starting to, intellectually understand what all of this could mean. Anyway, so that's the primary document for the first kind of mention of analytic versus synthesis. Analysis versus synthesis of basically of objects, of reality, of representation. Guillaume Apollinaire, Les Peintres Cubistes, which we're going to look at. The poet and close friend of Picasso and Braque, he coined the terms like scientific cubism, which we're going to look at, physical cubism, and orphism. While he didn't use analytic or synthetic, his categories overlapped conceptually. Apollinaire's book helped popularize cubism in Paris. And of course, Apollinaire is one of those names that kind of became canonical. So I think probably pretty quickly, and look at all those portraits probably helped in, sealing the deal as far as cubism. Is, like clearly an influence on people and clearly kind of involved from an early, like again, we saw that portrait from, I think it was 1908, Jean Metzinger, considered an early cubist work here. So, let us continue. And there's also André Salmon, Le Jeune Peintre Français, the young French painter. Another poet critic close to the group provided one of the earliest published defenses of Cubism. 1912. But you don't really get the concept of you don't really get the analytic versus synthetic cubism there. The concepts of analysis and synthesis were laid down by Kahnweiler in Der Weg zum Kubismus. Apollinaire gave cubism its broader theoretical poetic framework. The actual terms analytic and synthetic became canonical in the 20s and 30s through art historians building on Kahnweiler. So super interesting here. And as you read about this, and we'll come back to Cézanne. There's only so much you can do. This is what I was talking about. It's like, I'll do a simple little show on analytic versus synthetic cubism. You could do like 30 shows, is, the reality here. And Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, by the way, I think that's 1906. What year was Demoiselles d'Avignon? And then we'll get deeper. 1907. Okay. And so finally, for those that are wondering, again, let's look at this work now in terms of it being unfinished, which we will learn about in a future episode here. MoMA, internet working fabulously here. I can't wait to get new internet. It's going to be fabulous. So quite an interesting situation here when you start to think of this as a non finito. Super interesting, isn't it? Yes. So interesting. Let's continue. So here we are. Let's just get the page right. 25 here, 36 down there. I want to show you this. So this is Guillaume Apollinaire, the Cubist painters. And there is Apollinaire. So there is what he looks like in terms of when you think of that de Chirico. And there are some pretty interesting, actually, let me just bring up the title page. I believe it was here, because there's something very important here. Here it is. Les Peintres Cubistes. Guillaume Apollinaire, Méditation Esthétique. So aesthetic meditations. And then you see first series, and you see the list of painters here. And this is quite interesting in and of itself. Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, Jean Metzinger, Albert Gleizes, Juan Gris, Mille, Marie Laurencin, Fernand Léger, Francis Picabia, Marcel Duchamp, interestingly. And we're going to look at actually most of these artists here, just very briefly. Now let's go to so here we are. So just to set the scene here, we're on chapter 7, the first small 6 chapters, which happen over 25 pages, so they're not that long. It's pretty, how would you put it, poetic? I would say it's not the most, it's not what I'd call a super foundation. It's more kind of speculative and almost, I wouldn't say it borders on incoherence, but it's quite poetic. Let's put it that way, and quite suggestive without actually kind of really locking anything down. And then we get to chapter 7 where he starts to get, Guillaume Apollinaire in Les Peintres Cubistes, starts to lock things down a bit. The new school of painting bears the name of Cubism. So again, this was published in 1913. Okay, it was Henri Matisse who derisively christened it thus in the autumn of 1908 after being struck by the cubic appearance of some houses in a picture he had seen. Now, I actually brought this up. I believe it was in the readings I was doing, it was these landscapes. This is Georges Braque. And as you see here, it was actually here. You see these square brush marks? This is actually are considered some of the foundational works of Cubism, believe it or not. I mean, surprising to me as well. Landscape of Estaque. We can even, let me just bring that up here. Were Braque's, this just to prove the point, because were Braque's landscapes of Estaque, let me just check the spelling, foundational to Cubism. Yes. Are widely considered foundational to Cubism right alongside Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And we're always back to Cézanne, and that's actually what I always get the name Conviler. He starts with Cézanne in his book, interestingly. We'll take a look at that. Not this episode, though. So Cézanne's legacy. After Cézanne's death in 1906, Braque traveled to l'Estaque. So Cézanne is key to this whole thing, too. But all to say, it was apparently when Matisse saw these things and these little brush strokes, and over here, and described them as little cubes, that the term cubism came to happen. So I understand here. Again, this is not scholarship. This is just some guy on the internet exploring. So the new aesthetic first took shape in the mind of André Derain, but its most important and daring works were immediately produced by a great artist who must also be considered as a founder of the movement, namely Pablo Picasso. So, first of all, here's Derain, and WikiArt is just awesome here. And so Derain, again, you see what look like almost Braque's early works, which look like some sort of post-impressionism meets maybe fauvism a little bit. And you see, okay, we're at 1906. These are all chronological, wonderfully. 1906, and then you start to see here, you start to see the influence of Cézanne. 1907, landscape, just nice and simple. Let's continue. What else? 1907, let's try and take a representational one. Unfortunately, these don't open in a new tab. Oh, maybe we can do that. Open image in new tab. No, it's tiny. So let's do this. And again, you see what feels like. There we go. So this is André Derain. And you start to see the influence of Cézanne, which we'll look at maybe next episode when we look at the Conviler. So all very interesting. 1909, 1910. Right. So, yes. So there's André Derain. But its most important and daring works, okay, was Pablo Picasso. Picasso's inventions were confirmed by the good sense of Georges Braque, who as early as 1908 exhibited a cubist work at the Salon des Indépendants, and they were formalized in studies by Jean Metzinger. Now, I think I brought up, so we have Braque here, actually. So just to show you the evolution of Braque. So again, I mean, you'd almost think these are the same, like similar painters here, Derain and Braque. You see this kind of what looks like post-impressionism meets fauvism, right? Almost garish, the colors here. And then there's Landscape of Estaque, Georges Braque, okay? Almost looks like Derain. And here's House of Estaque. So here, and then here, you start to see what happens. Big trees at Estaque, and these famous works here. Let's see if maybe we can scroll through these a little bit. So here is This is George Braque. And A House at a Stack, big nude. Okay, this is 1908. Okay, big trees at a stack. Maybe I can make this bigger. And so here we go. So 1908, right? So, and again, it screams Cézanne, right? So picking up really where Cézanne left off, one could argue. So interesting here. Okay, and I think I brought up Jean Metzinger too. Here it is. So again, quite interesting. Again, a post-impressionist with these kind of fauvist, very, the wild beasts, very bright colors. This one almost prophetic here in its almost pixelation. There. So this is John Metzinger. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And as you see, around 1907, there we see cubism, and cubism. So, and then we see the biker, the cyclist, and everything, and then off we go. And let's just see where it goes. Does it continue forever? So John Metzinger, a very important artist here in this movement. And then it almost turns into like this Fernand Léger type look here, interestingly. So it kind of loses its identity a little bit. It's probably seen as old hat or kind of old-fashioned by the time of the 30s. Like, oh, you're still doing that cubism thing? And as I lose my mouse, this is my life. So I lost control of my mouse here. And then going back to it and going, oh, this is actually a major movement. It's probably, I can make some more cubist things once they realize, oh, this is historical. Okay, so continuing on, and let me just attempt to restore, and I restored it. It worked. Okay, since 1910, the Salon des Indépendants included works by Robert Delaunay, Marie Laurencin, Le Fauconnier, artists associated with the same movement. We're going to look at some of these artists as well. Okay. And the first appearance by the Cubists outside France was in Brussels that same year. In the preface to the exhibition, I then accepted, on behalf of the artists participating, the terms cubism and cubists. So kind of a key figure here, Guillaume Apollinaire. In late 1911, the Cubist exhibition at the Salon d'Automne caused a considerable stir. Neither Gleis, nor Metzinger, nor Fernand Léger escaped mockery. These artists were joined by a new painter, Marcel Duchamp, and a sculptor and architect, Duchamp Villon. Okay, so here we go. The difference between Cubism and earlier painting is that it is not an imitative art. I was discussing the dissolution of representation, but a conceptual art which reaches up to the heights of creation. So again, this is kind of classic Apollinaire here. Kind of ambiguous. You're like, what do you mean reaches up to the heights of creation? Just tell me what this is about. When depicting conceived reality or created reality, the painter can obtain a three-dimensional effect. Can, so to speak, cubify. He or she could not do that by just representing seen reality, unless he or she resorted to trompe-l'œil with foreshortening or perspective, which would distort the quality of the conceived or created form. I have broken cubism into four distinct tendencies. Two of these are parallel and pure. Scientific cubism is one of the pure tendencies. It is the art of painting new compositions with elements taken not from reality as it is seen, but from reality as it is known. And I have a couple of thoughts on this. Everyone is aware of this inner reality. One does not have to be educated to conceive of a round shape, for example. So, what does that make you think of? I'll tell you what it makes me think of is Platonism, is the world of the forms. It is the art of painting new compositions with elements taken not from reality as it is seen, from your perception, but as it is known. Everyone is aware of this inner reality. One does not have to be educated to conceive of a circle, a round shape. I mean, this is like, it seems like Platonism 101, for example. The geometrical appearance which so struck those who saw the first scientific canvases, again, geometry, Scientific canvases. By the way, like music to my ears over here. I go, oh, I like how these guys think. We're thinking along the same lines here. Those who saw the first scientific canvases resulted from the fact that essential reality was there, depicted with great purity, with contingent visual and anecdotal elements eliminated from the work. But again, trying to get to a deeper understanding, almost like a deeper representation than what our perception is giving us, is another way of putting it. The painters associated with this art are Picasso, whose luminous art belongs to the other pure Cubist tendencies, George Braque, Metzinger, Albert Gleises, and Mademoiselle Laurencin, and Juan Gris. So we're going to look at most of these artists. We're going to do just a quick look to give us a sense as we close the show. Physical cubism, so there's scientific cubism, and there's physical cubism, is the art of painting new compositions with elements taken from reality as it is seen. This art is, however, associated with cubism through its constructive discipline. It has a great future in historical painting. It has a clear social role, but it is not a pure art. It confuses the subject and images. And you wonder to yourself, and maybe we can ask ChatGPT, like, is physical cubism is Apollinaire's notion of physical cubism an antecedent to synthetic cubism? Yes. Okay, so we are on the money there. You could definitely read Apollinaire's physical cubism as an early articulation of the ideas that later became codified as synthetic cubism. Interesting. And here we are right in the middle of synthetic cubism, 1912 to 1914, published in 1913. He distinguishes 4 types of cubism, so we're going into that. And so the 4 types, links to synthetic cubism involve collage, papier-collé, so we're discussing this, again, building up. It's synthesized. In Ballard's terminology, it added fiction. You're adding fiction onto the work rather than just taking the table and trying to kind of analyzing it, boiling it down to its components to come to a deeper understanding, right? So this notion of looking at the painting composition, looking at the content in terms of, is this analytic or synthetic content? Very fascinating. Is this fiction or nonfiction? So let's go back. Now, okay, and it gets even better, actually. So here's physical cubism, as we were discussing. Constructive. It has a clear social role, but it is not a pure art. It confuses, let me make this larger for you. It confuses the subject and images. We're right here. And then you just have to imagine, for those that watch this show, this is just music to my ears here, music to my eyes. The scientist painter who created this tendency is Le Fauconnier. Now, I believe I brought up Henri Le Fauconnier. Here it is. So, describing as who brought about the synthetic. And so here, are these in order? Let's see. Not a ton of works here, interestingly. So here, we have 1910, 1911, 1912. No real great example, maybe here. Maybe examples we don't see, right? But there is the addition of color. We have to admit that. So bringing color back in, it's almost like another interpretation of what happened here is if we look at, for example, Jean Metzinger, you get this post-impressionism and the colors. It's almost like those who know Henry Lacrosse, I think is the name, I think a British impressionist. You start getting these almost garish colors, and it's like they just had to go, okay, we need to restart the heart, so to speak, color-wise, because these colors are getting out of control, and I'm not sure it's working, right? And then so let's just mute this whole thing down. Let's start from scratch. from a palette perspective, is one could argue started to happen. Like, let's mute this thing right down. And then they started to bring color back in a much more pleasant way. Okay. So we're almost here. So the scientific painter who created this tendency is Le Fauconnier. So we just saw some examples. Interesting. Orphic cubism. Right? So cubisms you've never heard of before, potentially, at least. So Orphism is another word for it. Orphic cubism is the other major tendency in modern painting. Now, some people attribute this to kind of a more abstract-esque, let's see, it might be more subtle, though, than that. It is the art of painting new compositions with elements not taken from reality as it is seen. So you could call this super-synthetic, right? One could argue, but entirely created by the artist and invested by him or her with a powerful reality. Works by Orphic artists must offer simultaneously pure aesthetic pleasure, a clear perceptible construction, and a meaning, the subject which is sublime. This is pure art. So, and now we can look at some of these examples. The light in works by Picasso contains this art. The light in works by Picasso, which Robert Delaunay is inventing in his way, and towards which Fernand Léger, Francis Picabia, and Marcel Duchamp are also striving. Now, I have some others. So here's Fernand Léger, who's just, now here's early kind of Cubist works, interestingly, by Fernand Léger. And but you see, I suppose, now this is written in 1913, though, but one can imagine it's starting to get, where's the table? Right? Like, what is the name of that? Geometric standards, contrasts of forms. We're starting to lose the objects, one could argue. Again, it's the dissolution of representation seems to be what these people are dealing with, as well as reinventing the color palette, which had completely gone off the rails, one could argue. So interesting there. Here's Picabia. Was Picabia mentioned in here? Yes. Okay, excellent. And so here's Francis Picabia. Interesting, almost like Monet here with this portrait of Notre Dame. So here's 1908. We're starting to see something here. The procession at Seville. So here we're the dances of spring, 1912. Young girl, 1912. Right, and 1913. Right, so again, and colors starting to be added to the mix. Quite beautiful works here. This is Picabia. I think a noted Dadaist, yeah, because when I think of Picabia, I think of works sort of like this, right? So, yeah. So interesting, and look at where this went. Wow. Okay, and finally, let's look at Duchamp. Interestingly, again, included here. So early Duchamp looks like, again, what you'd almost like Pissarro here in 1910. So still kind of, working out the Impressionists. And really probably the Impressionists were finally starting to be, I imagine were starting to be integrated at that point as, awesome. Whereas before they were kind of more controversial. Standing nude, this is quite beautiful here. And again, what is this? Like kind of this non-finito left, just showing some brush marks. And here, though, let's go here. Portrait of a chess player. You see these kinds of what could be called cubist. As I learned this website here, this is experiments here. Do we have info? No, Sad Young Man in a Train, famous Duchamp work, kind of in the spirit of Nude Descending a Staircase. Quite powerful, quite emotive, affecting, I should say. Interesting here, and yeah, so Duchamp. Early paintings by Duchamp. Look at this. This is kind of working towards the glass. Very interesting here. Nude Descending a Staircase, of course. It's too bad we don't get the title. I hit the I, but it just brings you back to here. Nude Descending a Staircase, number 2. And so we're in 1912 here. And yeah, let's leave Duchamp there. And finally, there's instinctive cubism. So now Orphic cubism, we also, I believe I brought up Robert Delaunay. Let's just see here. Okay, excellent. Another example of this kind of post-impressionistic look, almost garish colors here, right? And then you see this move with Eiffel Tower, 1911. You start to see a move towards a kind of, cubist representation here. And then, what year is this? This is 1912. And I think this is what Apollinaire is referring to when he talks about Orphism, right? So it's interesting. He didn't use the term abstract. It was Orphism. And that's we could probably spend some time on that, but I mean, that's kind of almost referring to the Greeks. We can ask ChatGPT quickly. But these are the kinds of works, as you see, it's almost got that cubist element, but where's the thing being represented? Again, it's back to this dissolution of representation and the reinvention of the palette. I think is worth mentioning, because it really did go off the rails, one could argue. Let's see what else we have. Finally, instinctive cubism is the art of painting new compositions taken not from reality as it is seen, but as it is suggested to the artist by instinct and intuition, an art which has long been tending towards Orphism. Instinctive artists lack lucidity and an artistic creed. Very many artists belong in the instinctive cubism category. I wonder if you'd call that like art brut. Born of French Impressionism, this movement has now spread throughout Europe. So just kind of interesting. Finally, to wrap things up here, what is meant by instinctive cubism? Let's just see what it says. It is the least clearly defined, but here's what it means. Here's what he meant. So here are the four cubisms: scientific, physical, Orphic, and instinctive. Instinctive cubism referred to artists who practice cubism without systematic theory, guided more by intuition, temperament, or personal style than by rigorous structural or conceptual analysis. In contrast to scientific cubism or physical cubism, instinctive cubists were less analytical, more expressive, or spontaneous. Is this comparable to art brut? Nice connection. There are parallels, but important differences. Let me lay it out. Instinctive cubism, artists working with cubist vocabulary intuitively, decoratively, lyrically, rather than through systematic analysis. It was still part of the Parisian avant-garde. Marie-Laurent Saint, who actually I have here, we'll look at her maybe last. Cubist touch, but not hard cubism. Let's actually look at her work. Okay, so here's Marie-Laurent Saint. To wrap up the four cubisms here. So here's 1910, 1911, 1913, and 1913, and 1915. Okay, so by the time, so here, I mean, this is around when Apollinaire is writing, if not after. So kind of interesting. Yeah, I mean, another one, I wouldn't consider this like quote unquote naive painting in the sense that we talk about Henri Rousseau. It seems actually quite related to the other works here. So there's Marie-Laurent Saint, soft color, lyrical figuration, cubist touched, but not hard cubism. Interesting, almost like a combination. Whereas art brut, defined by Dubuffet as raw art created outside cultural institutions. So whereas this was more in the Paris scene, instinctive cubism, by children, psychiatric patients, prisoners, and so-called outsiders. Celebrated precisely because it was not part of the academy, galleries, or avant-garde debates. Emphasized, here's the connection though, emphasized authenticity, spontaneity, lack of formal training, and art free from cultural conventions, at least in terms of the definition. I'm not sure if I'd compare Laurent Saint there to those. So both invoke instinct, intuition, and a kind of non-systematic creativity. Both are positioned as alternatives to rigidly intellectualized or formalized art. So I think that gives us enough on instinctive cubisms. Cézanne's last paintings and his watercolors can be categorized as cubist. And then it goes off, but Courbet is the father of the new painters, and André Derain, on whom I will have more to say in the future, was the eldest of his beloved sons, for he can be found at the beginning of the Fauvist movement, which was kind of a precursor of Cubism. And again, at the beginning of that great subjective movement. Interesting. So I think that is a wrap, my friend. Did we look at Albert Gleizes? We did. And who? We looked at Fauconnier. Juan Gris. So very important, actually, early, as you see here, working in 1911. And here, portrait, this is pretty famous, portrait of Pablo Picasso. Gorgeous work, isn't it? Gorgeous painting. Fabulous painting, 1912, all right? So right in between, you might say, the analytic and synthetic phase, this is gorgeous. Great artist. In a sense, to a certain degree, could probably use a little bit more attention. So we do that here. So very interesting. Fernand Léger we looked at, and I think that's it. Duchamp. That is your show, my friends. I hope you enjoyed that, and until next time, take care.